about it. So, for instance, we ran a workshop on ways of reducing gun crime, and that would be an example of a stakeholder-driven problem. We're doing quite a lot in medical and care, particularly in the aging process, and that again is a nice stakeholder-driven project. At the other extreme, you have something like synthetic biology, and when we first got involved in that a number of years ago, there really weren't any stakeholders who were saying this is what we want from synthetic biology. It was much more a case of a number of technologies had come together to create the possibility of synthetic biology, but nobody really knew what we were going to do with it. So you could see a continuum there, but we tend to see that distinction. Fundamentally, the people who get invited to a sandpit have to represent quite a wide range of disciplines. And the way that we always think about it is if two participants could essentially be swapped for each other, we probably only want one of them. And in a sandpit, although we have run events of 150 to 200 people, it tends to be that you have a group of 20, perhaps 30 people. So we're always looking for maximum diversity in that. Funding, the funding for a sandpit has gone up over time. It started off perhaps £500,000 to £1 million. They're now using them to fund quite substantial research. We recently ran one for the UK and the US, a joint project on nitrogen cycle, where the funding was $12 million at the end of the process. And there are issues around that, which I'll talk about in a moment. But then also, the way a sandpit works is typically we find ourselves a nice country house hotel quite a long way from anywhere. We all go off there for a week, and we think very intensively. The entire process, in effect, sort of starts Sunday evening and finishes Friday lunchtime, something like that. And during that time, it really is a very intensive process. And although it's not absolutely essential, normally what we're looking for is to create team-based research proposals. And again, although some of the researchers may know each other prior to the start of it, most of the time these are completely new multidisciplinary teams that form during that week. So again, it's quite an unusual process. If you flip to the next slide, please. The structure of a sandpit has evolved over time. We've added some bits to it, but there are some roles which have remained relatively constant. Obviously, we have a group of participants, and the normal way that a sandpit is populated is that there is a public call and people fill in expressions of interest. The funding agency, and sometimes we're involved in this, then review all of those candidates, look to build a diverse population, and they've also used for many years the services of a psychologist who's looking for people who will be able to play nicely together. Our rule of thumb is that we always recommend we select people who demonstrate empathy over eminence. We start with the assumption that everyone in the community is going to be smart. What we're looking for is people who can collaborate. In many cases, there is also someone who's referred to as the director, and this doesn't have to be someone who is an expert in the topic, and in fact, in many ways, it's helpful if he or she isn't, but they would be regarded as academically respected. And the director, in conjunction with the mentors, who are a group of 3 to 5, typically academics, are responsible for being able to answer the question, is this scientifically interesting yet? And there's a very intensive feedback process where it's almost as if your peer review panel and the participants are co-developing proposals. So there is a slightly odd dynamic there, but it does seem to work really well, because by the end of the week, the mentors and the directors are in a position to answer the question, is this scientifically interesting and consequently worth funding? And at the same time, they've developed a pretty good understanding of the way the ideas have emerged. So that's the model. Funders are typically there just to answer technical questions about, can I have 3 postdocs, please? The facilitators, that would be us, we design and run the process. So the basic distinction is we do not get involved in the content, we take care of the process of creative thinking. And then we have 2 other groups that may or may not be present. Provocateurs are people that we invite along to give very short presentations, and typically what we're looking for is people who might be able to challenge the orthodoxy, or who have dealt with a problem that is somehow analogous, and they've done it in an interesting way. And the instructions that we give to them is we ask them to come along, talk for 15 minutes without any requirement to prove that what they're saying is true. Because the thing about provocateurs is we're not really interested in what they say. We're interested in what their presentation makes the participants think. So it is this sort of second order effect, and we're just trying to help the participants break patterns. And then finally, we may have stakeholders, if it is that kind of stakeholder-driven sandpit. If we just go to the next slide, just briefly, these are events that we've worked on over a period of time. So it runs the range from very much a combination of sociology and technology, and looking at gun crime through various forms of chemistry, some interesting work on visualization in large biospaces. And if you get the slides and click the more details, that will take you through to the EPSRC link. We've now run many more for individual universities and the National Science Foundation. I'm happy to tell you about that. If you go to the next slide, so far I've talked about the funding agencies and the process. Our involvement is that my colleagues and I are interested in the science of deliberate creativity. And we got involved after EPSRC had run their first sandpit, and it had gone okay, but not great. And so they came to us and asked if we could bring a theoretical perspective from the work on creative problem solving into the design of a sandpit. And we've refined this over a number of years, but it does seem to be the case that the slightly more general approach to creative problem solving actually fits quite well in the scientific method and in the sandpit process. And again, we've written quite a lot about that. So on the blog, you'll be able to see how we tackle it. And I won't go into more detail on that now. But if I go to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about what a sandpit looks like at a practical level. Now, this breaks down over about 4 to 5 days. It can be slightly shorter, but it becomes difficult. What we've found is if you try and compress this into too short a period of time, the ideas that you get become more predictable. So it's probably fair to say that it takes time to get beyond the obvious connections. But during the course of a sandpit, there is an initial getting to know you stage and some sort of recognition of what is the nature of this problem. And this is very important because if we've been successful in recruiting a diverse population, then there should be a lot of people in the room who either don't really understand the core of the problem as it was originally framed, or who have a number of different perspectives on this. So the first day or so is really about exchanging and developing an understanding of what the problem might be. And we then typically move into saying, well, that's the problem as given. How else might it be framed? And this is probably the most important step in the process. if we're in a situation where scientific progress has essentially slowed, there is an effective method of dealing with it, which is simply to reframe the problem in new and different ways and see if that gives us an alternative routes. And in many ways, that's the most exciting part of a sandpit, and that you will have this almost build-up of pressure where people are frustrated they're not making any progress, and somebody at some point will say, well, what about if we were to think this? And suddenly new opportunities open up. So it is interesting that from our perspective, the problem reframing is probably more important than the idea generation stage, which I'm suggesting comes next. Obviously, I'm laying this out in a linear process and it looks neat. It's nothing like that in reality. But the idea generation typically leads to the formation of little teams. And we always emphasize to the participant that your association with a team is entirely temporary. And on the face of it, that sounds unhelpful. But what we're really talking about here is being able to say the shape and size of your team will change over the next 24 hours as new ideas develop. Teams split, new teams merge, entirely new ideas sometimes emerge on the very last day of the event. And so we try and structure it in that way. During the back half of a, so typically from Wednesday onwards, if we're running a 5-day event, we're encouraging people to pitch ideas in a terribly loosely formed state to the whole group of participants. And we have a way of being able to get really fast and really constructive feedback from people. Now, of course, it introduces an interesting dynamic, which is everyone is there partly for the love of science and partly because they'd like to go home with a grant. So you get this odd co-opetition emerge. But almost always, it is the love of science that trumps the need for money, and you will see some amazing collaborative behavior emerge from that. If we go to the next